One building in Hollywood processed every frame of The Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, and Singin' in the Rain. Every red, every green, every shadow. One address, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. For 30 years, more than half of all color films released by major American studios passed through a single factory on a side street with no sign out front. The prints that building made in 1939 still hold their color today. Pull one from a vault, hold it to the light. The cayenne has not shifted. The magenta has not faded. 87 years, and the dye has not moved. The films that replaced them, cheaper, faster, shot on Eastman Color, started fading within a decade. Reds first, then yellows. Then everything turns to a cold blue ghost. Thousands of films from the 1970s survive only as shadows of what they were. The permanent prints came from the factory that closed. The disposable prints came from the process that won. Technicolor did not lose because the product failed. The product was superior. It is measurably, chemically, archivally superior to this day. The company that invented Hollywood color, that built the cameras, mixed the dyes, trained the hands, controlled the pipeline from lens to projector, should have owned the century. It did not. By 1975, the dye transfer presses were shut down. The vats were drained. The parking lot that once filled before dawn went quiet for the last time. A workforce whose hands could judge the accuracy of a color print by the sound of a roller, a wet click for good contact, a hiss for slippage, was out of a job. Their skill had no market. Their craft had no successor. Their building became a contamination site, its soil laced with decades of solvent and silver and acid, disputed in lawsuits, measured in parts per billion. 50 years of manufacturing the most beautiful images in American cinema. Gone in under a decade. It was not corruption, not mismanagement, not a single bad bet. It was not that Technicolor stopped innovating. It was not that audiences stopped caring about color. It was not even that a competitor built a better product, because it did not. In the printing room on the second floor of the plant, a woman loaded film into a transfer press 3 times per frame, thousands of frames per shift. She never described the process in technical language. She said a good print felt like a door latching. When the press was retired, no manual captured what she knew. No manual could. The knowledge lived in her hands, and her hands were not a technology anyone thought to preserve. How does a company that controls an entire color pipeline lose that control? How does a product that outlasts its replacement get replaced? And what happens to the ground and the people underneath a factory after the factory stops being useful? This is not a story about a company that failed. This is a story about an industry that chose speed over permanence and then forgot there had ever been a choice. The real war was never between Technicolor and Kodak. It was between what lasts and what is available on Tuesday. A factory built for color, rooms designed for darkness, and a silence that is still spreading. If you watch to the end, you will never look at a movie's colors the same way again. Subscribe now, because this channel tells the stories that Hollywood left out of the credits. In 1915, in a basement laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 2 men who had never made a movie built a camera that could photograph the world in 2 colors. Herbert Kalmus was a mechanical engineer. Daniel Comstock was a physicist. Between them, they had enough optics theory to split a beam of light through a prism and enough stubbornness to believe Hollywood would pay for the result. They called the company Technicolor. The name was a nod to MIT, tech, and a promise to an industry that was still projecting in shades of gray. The first Technicolor footage looked like a fever dream. Colors bled, frames jittered. Projectionists had to be bribed or threatened to run the prints because the special equipment scratched their machines. In 1917, Kalmus screened a short demonstration reel for investors in New York. The reds pulsed, the greens swam. One viewer compared it to watching the world through a migraine. Kalmus kept talking. He had the peculiar gift of describing what a technology would become rather than what it was. By 1922, Technicolor had shot its first feature-length movie, The Toll of the Sea, using a two-color cemented process that glued two thin strips of film together, back to back, one carrying red, one carrying green. It was better than anything audiences had seen. It was also unstable. The cemented prints curled in projectors. They buckled in heat. Theater owners reported strips peeling apart mid-screening, the audience watching as a love scene separated into two ghostly halves. Kalmus did not see a failure. He saw proof of demand. What Kalmus understood, earlier than almost anyone in the industry, was that color was not an effect. It was infrastructure. You could not color a movie the way you painted a house. One coat, your choice of brand. Color required a closed system, proprietary cameras, proprietary film stock, proprietary processing, proprietary printing, and a proprietary lab to do it all under one roof. Every studio that wanted Technicolor had to rent Technicolor's cameras. Every foot of film those cameras shot had to be processed at Technicolor's plant, and every print that left the plant had to meet Technicolor's standards, enforced by Technicolor's own color consultants, who sat on set and told directors what shades their actors could wear. This was not a service, it was a bottleneck, and Kalmus built it on purpose. In 1923, he moved the company to Hollywood, not to be closer to the glamour, to be closer to the supply chain. Film stock deteriorated in transit. Negatives were irreplaceable. If you wanted to process color film without losing a day to shipping, you needed your lab within driving distance of every major studio lot. Kalmus found a building at 1006 North Cole Avenue, a low industrial block in the middle of Hollywood, walking distance from Paramount, a short drive from the rest. Within a year, a processing plant and camera department were running at that address. From the outside, it looked like nothing. No marquee, no studio gate, no tourists. A flat-roofed building with loading docks and small windows set high in the walls, the kind of windows designed to keep light out, not let it in. Trucks arrived before dawn and left after dark. The building hummed. If you pressed your hand against the exterior wall on a warm afternoon, you could feel the vibration of the machines inside. This was the paradox that would define the place for 50 years. The most vivid images in American cinema were manufactured in rooms that were essentially light-proof boxes. The business of color required darkness, dark rooms, sealed chemical baths, windowless printing stages where operators worked by the glow of safe lights, loading matrices by touch. The factory floor smelled of acetic acid, methanol, and warm gelatin, a smell that clung to workers' clothes and hair that their families recognized before they walked through the door. Kalmus never talked about the smell. He talked about the future. In 1932, Technicolor perfected three-strip color, a camera that used a beam-splitting prism to expose three separate negatives simultaneously, one for each primary color. The system was revolutionary. It was also enormous. The three-strip camera weighed over 100 pounds. It required its own power supply. It generated so much heat that early tests fogged the film inside the magazine. Cinematographers hated it until they saw the dailies. The dailies changed everything. For the first time, skin looked like skin. Grass looked like grass. A red dress in a doorway could stop your breathing. Walt Disney used the process for Flowers and Trees in 1932 and won an Academy Award. Becky Sharp followed in 1935 as the first live-action three-strip feature. By 1939, two of the most successful films ever made, The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, were Technicolor productions, and the plant on Cole Avenue was running 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Every frame of those films passed through this building. Every frame was washed, developed, printed, and inspected by human hands in a factory that most moviegoers would never think about and no tourist would ever visit. The parking lot filled before sunrise. The machines did not stop at night. The woman who loaded the matrices did not watch movies much. Her name was not famous, and her hands were. In the printing room on the second floor of the Cole Avenue plant, she fed blank film stock into a transfer machine that pressed dyed gelatin matrices against the receiving strip. One color at a time, 3 passes per frame, thousands of frames per reel. The pressure had to be exact. Too light and the color ghosted. Too heavy and the dye bled past the emulsion edge, turning flesh tones into bruises. She judged the pressure by the sound the rollers made. A wet click meant good contact. A hiss meant slippage. She never described it in those terms. She said she could feel when a print was right the way you feel when a door latches. This was dye transfer printing, and it was the reason Technicolor looked like nothing else. The process did not work the way modern color film works. Modern color film, Eastman Color, Fuji Color, the stocks that would eventually replace Technicolor, embeds the dyes chemically inside the film strip during development. One strip, one pass, one bath. Dye transfer was different. It was closer to lithography than photography. You started with 3 black and white separation negatives, one for each color record. From those negatives, you struck 3 matrices, relief images in hardened gelatin, each one carrying the physical topography of a single color. Then, you soaked each matrix in its corresponding dye, cyan, magenta, yellow, and pressed it against a receiving film strip, transferring the color by absorption. 3 impressions, 3 dye baths, 3 chances to fail. The result was color that seemed to exist inside the film rather than on top of it. Dye transfer prints had a density and saturation that audiences could feel, even if they could not name. Reds were not red. They were the idea of red. Deep, almost liquid, with a glow that seemed to come from behind the screen. Blacks were true black, not the muddy charcoal of later prints. Skin had warmth, fabric had weight. When Dorothy opened the door of her gray Kansas farmhouse and stepped into Oz, the gasp in theaters was not a reaction to plot. It was a physiological response to color so vivid it felt aggressive. That aggression was manufactured. Every morning, the lab at Cole Avenue mixed its dye solutions from scratch. Cyan, magenta, yellow. The formulations were proprietary, guarded with a secrecy that bordered on paranoia. Technicolor employed its own chemists to monitor pH, temperature, concentration. A shift in humidity could throw a batch. A new lot of gelatin from a different supplier could change the absorption rate of a matrix. The variables were so numerous and so fine-grained that the process resisted standardization. What held it together was not a formula. It was a workforce. The women and men in the plant knew things that existed nowhere in writing. They knew that the cyan matrix on a Wednesday afternoon in July would transfer differently than the same matrix on a Monday morning in January, because the building's temperature changed with the seasons and the air conditioning was uneven. They knew which dye lots ran warm and which ran cool. They knew by the smell of the acetic acid rinse whether the stop bath was still active. They calibrated by instinct and corrected by eye, holding test strips up to a standardized light box and making decisions in 2 seconds that determined whether a reel matched the one before it. This was embodied craft knowledge, the kind that lives in hands and nostrils and the muscles of the lower back from standing at a transfer station for 8 hours. It could not be written into a manual. It could not be taught in a classroom. It transferred only by apprenticeship, one body next to another, over months and years. And it was the reason Technicolor's monopoly held as long as it did. You could not simply build a competing lab. You could build the machines, copy the chemistry, license the optics, but you could not replicate the 10,000 micro-judgments that a trained operator made every shift without thinking about them. Kalmus understood this, though he described it differently. He called it quality control. What he meant was that the product and the workforce were inseparable, and that inseparability was the moat. By the early 1940s, the Cole Avenue plant had expanded. More stages, more chemical storage, more staff. The war helped. The U.S. government contracted Technicolor to process training films, reconnaissance footage, propaganda reels, anything that needed color to convey information that black and white could not. The plant ran at capacity. Workers earned steady wages. The parking lot was full at shift change, and the diner 2 blocks east on Santa Monica Boulevard knew the schedule by the rush. But the system's greatest strength was also its vulnerability. Every studio that used Technicolor was a captive customer. They rented the cameras, they paid the processing fees, they accepted the color consultants, they waited in line when the lab was backed up, and they resented it. In 1947, the U.S. government filed an antitrust consent decree against Technicolor. The company was forced to loosen some of its exclusivity agreements. Studios could now, in theory, process their own color. But in practice, no one had the infrastructure or the expertise. The decree cracked the legal monopoly. The real monopoly, the one that lived in the hands of the matrix loaders and the noses of the dye chemists, remained intact. For now. The diner still filled at shift change. The machine still hummed past midnight. And somewhere in Rochester, New York, Eastman Kodak was testing a single-strip color film that required no matrices, no dye baths, no transfer presses, and no one who could hear the difference between a click and a hiss. The film stock was called Eastman Color, and it arrived the way most revolutions arrive, not as a threat, but as a convenience. Kodak introduced it commercially in 1950. 1 strip of film, 3 color layers built into the emulsion. You shot it in any standard 35mm camera. You processed it in a standard lab bath. You printed it on standard equipment. No rented cameras, no proprietary matrices, no 3-pass dye transfer, no Technicolor. The first studios to test it did so quietly, almost apologetically, the way a man leaves a tailor he respects for a department store that is closer to his house. The results were acceptable. Not Technicolor level, the blacks were softer, the reds thinner. The overall image had a flatness that trained eyes noticed immediately. But trained eyes were not the audience. The audience noticed that the movie was in color. That was enough. The economics were devastating. A Technicolor 3-strip production required renting cameras that cost more per week than most crew members earned per month. Processing at Cole Avenue added days to the post-production schedule. Release prints, the copies shipped to theaters, had to be struck one at a time on the dye transfer press, each one requiring 3 passes and human inspection. An Eastman Color release print could be struck on automated equipment in a single pass at a fraction of the cost in any commercial lab in the country. A studio that switched to Eastman Color did not merely save money, it eliminated a dependency. By 1953, the migration was underway. Not a stampede, Technicolor still had contracts, relationships, prestige. But the pipeline was shifting. Younger producers who had grown up watching Technicolor films were now making their own, and they had never experienced the process from the inside. They had never stood in the printing room. They had never smelled the dye baths. To them, Technicolor was a brand name on a title card, not a physical reality. They chose Eastman Color the way their generation chose convenience in everything else, not as a rejection of quality, but as a failure to perceive what quality cost. This was the generational break that no monopoly survives. The customers who understood what Technicolor did, who had seen the difference, who had waited for the prints and cursed the expense and then watched the dailies and understood, were retiring, dying, moving into television. The customers who replaced them had grown up inside Kodak's ecosystem. They bought Kodak stock. They used Kodak cameras in film school. They processed Kodak film in university labs. By the time they arrived at a studio with the authority to choose a color process, the choice had already been made for them by 15 years of habit. Inside the Cole Avenue plant, The shift was physical before it was financial. The parking lot thinned, not dramatically, not the way a factory closes in a newspaper headline. Slowly. One fewer car on Monday, two fewer the following week. The loading dock schedule loosened. Where trucks had once lined up before dawn, now there were gaps. A driver waited 20 minutes with nothing to pick up. Then 40 minutes. Then he was reassigned to another route. The dye mixing room still operated, but the batches were smaller. A chemist who had once prepared solutions for 8-hour runs now prepared them for 4. The surplus went down the drain. The smell was the same: acetic acid, methanol, warm gelatin. But the volume was less, and in a chemical plant, lower volume means higher waste per unit. The efficiency of the operation depended on scale. Without scale, every print cost more than the last. Kalmus saw it. He was in his 70s by then, still involved, still talking about the future in the present tense. But the future had developed a preference, and it was not for craftsmanship. It was for speed. In 1953, the same year Eastman Color prints began flooding the market, 20th Century Fox released The Robe in CinemaScope, a widescreen process shot on Eastman Color negative. The film made more money than any Technicolor production that year. The message was not subtle. Technicolor adapted. It had to. The company began offering Eastman Color processing alongside its own dye transfer work, a concession that felt, to the workers in the plant, like a hospital adding a wing for the disease that was killing its patients. The same building that had manufactured the most controlled color in cinema history now also ran Eastman Color prints through automated baths, the kind of work any commercial lab could do. The dye transfer presses still operated, but they operated less. The women who loaded matrices found their shifts shortened. The men who mixed dyes found their batches smaller. No one made a speech. No one gathered the staff and explained that the business model was eroding. The plant simply became quieter in increments, the way a house becomes quieter after children leave. The same rooms, the same furniture, but the sound is different because the density of life inside has changed. The machines still ran, but the hum had a different pitch when half the stations were idle. By 1960, the majority of Hollywood color productions were being shot on Eastman Color. Technicolor dye transfer prints were still requested for prestige productions, films where a director or cinematographer insisted on the richness, the density, the particular way a Technicolor print held its blacks. But these were exceptions. The default had flipped. Color was no longer Technicolor's product. Color was Kodak's product. Technicolor was becoming an option, and in Hollywood, an option is the last stop before a memory. The diner 2 blocks east closed in 1962. The owner said the lunch crowd had thinned. He did not say why. Everyone on the block knew why. What most people never thought about was what the color was made of. Not the light, the chemistry, the actual liquid substances that soaked into gelatin, that washed through trays, that drained into pipes, that went somewhere. Every frame of Technicolor film that left the Cole Avenue plant left behind a residue. Dye that did not transfer. Rinse water carrying traces of acid, methanol, formaldehyde, solvents used to clean the equipment between runs. Fixing baths saturated with silver compounds. Stop baths gone acidic past reuse. These were not exotic chemicals. They were standard for any photographic processing operation in the mid-20th century. But standard does not mean safe. It means familiar. And familiarity is what allows risk to become invisible. The workers knew the chemicals by their effects before they knew them by their names. The sting in the nostrils when you opened the door to the mixing room on a warm day. That was acetic acid. The headache that started behind the eyes around hour 6 of a long shift, that was solvent vapor, probably methanol, possibly something else, accumulating in a room where the ventilation was designed for a cooler decade. The dry, cracked skin on the hands of anyone who worked the rinse stations without gloves. And many did, because the gloves reduced the tactile sensitivity that the job demanded. You could not feel whether a matrix was seating properly through rubber, so you worked barehanded, and your skin paid for it, and you did not file a complaint because everyone's hands looked like that. This was the economy of the body in industrial film processing. Your senses were your instruments, and your instruments degraded with use. The nose that could detect a bad dye lot by smell at the start of a career was less reliable after a decade of chronic low-level exposure. The eyes that could judge color balance under a safe light grew less certain. The hands that felt the click of a good transfer grew less sensitive. The craft consumed the tools it depended on, and the tools were human. There were no documentary crews in the mixing room. No photographers captured the yellow stains on the concrete floor where dye solutions had spilled and been mopped but not fully removed. No one filmed the drums of waste solvent stacked in the backlot waiting for pickup, or the drains that carried rinse water into the city sewer system under permits that specified volume and content but could not specify what happened to the residue once it left the pipe. What happened was accumulation in the soil, in the concrete, in the groundwater table beneath Hollywood, which sits in a basin that drains slowly and forgets nothing. Every industrial site in the neighborhood contributed: dry cleaners, auto shops, print houses, other photo labs. But a facility that processed millions of feet of film per year, for decades, using solvent-based chemistry at industrial scale, leaves a signature in the ground that is distinct and persistent. This was not a scandal. It was physics. Solvents migrate downward through soil. They pool on impermeable layers. They spread laterally through groundwater. They do this whether anyone intends it or monitors it or even knows it is happening. By the time anyone tests for contamination, the chemistry has been traveling for years, sometimes decades, following geology rather than property lines. At one Technicolor facility, a spill of 20 gallons of a toxic cleaning solvent triggered evacuations and medical treatment for workers. 20 gallons. Picture a standard bathtub that holds roughly 40 gallons. Half a bathtub of solvent on a factory floor, and the building had to be cleared. The workers who were treated went home that night to families who asked what happened and got answers that were vague because the workers themselves were not always told the names of the chemicals they had been exposed to. They knew the smell. They did not always know the molecule. 20 gallons makes the record because it was an acute event, sudden, visible, requiring response. But acute events are not how most chemical damage works. Most chemical damage works the way the diner closed. Slowly, without announcement, through accumulation of small exposures that do not individually cross any threshold, but collectively change the composition of a body, or a building, or a water table in ways that only become legible years later when someone finally tests. The National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health conducted evaluations of film processing facilities during this era. The findings were consistent. Workers in photographic processing environments faced chronic exposure to chemical vapors at levels that warranted improved ventilation, protective equipment, and monitoring. The language was bureaucratic. The reality was specific. It meant that the air inside places like the Cole Avenue plant contained on an ordinary working day concentrations of chemicals that a federal agency considered worth investigating. None of this appeared on screen. The credits of a Technicolor film listed the director, the cinematographer, the stars, the composer. They listed color by Technicolor. They did not list the dye mixers, the matrix loaders, the rinse operators, or the air they breathed. They did not list the 20 gallons. They did not list the soil. The screen was saturated. The air could not be. And by the late 1960s, with dye transfer volumes falling and Eastman Color processing rising, the chemical profile of the plant was changing too. Eastman Color processing used its own cocktail, different developers, different bleaches, different fixers. The old Technicolor chemistry did not vanish from the building. It layered new chemicals on top of old residues, new drains connected to old pipes. The building was a palimpsest of industrial chemistry, each era leaving its trace in the walls and the floor and the ground beneath. Nobody was measuring the layers. The machines were still running. There was still work to do, even if there was less of it. And in a factory where the product was beauty, the last thing anyone wanted to discuss was what beauty left behind. The end came with a date, the way institutional deaths always do. In 1975, Technicolor shut down its dye transfer printing operation at the Hollywood plant. The last matrices were loaded, the last dye baths were drained, the last prints were inspected, approved, and shipped. Then the transfer presses stopped, and the particular silence that followed was different from every silence before it, because this one was not a pause between shifts. It was a conclusion. The decision was not sudden. It had been approaching for 20 years, visible to anyone who tracked the numbers rather than the reputation. By the early 1970s, dye transfer printing accounted for a shrinking fraction of the plant's output. The bulk of the work was Eastman Color processing, the same automated bath and print work that any commercial lab could perform, and that dozens of commercial labs were performing at competitive rates, without the overhead of maintaining a dye transfer infrastructure that ran at partial capacity. Keeping the transfer presses operational required skilled technicians, proprietary chemistry, and a supply chain for specialized materials that fewer and fewer vendors were willing to maintain for a shrinking customer base. The cost per print rose as volume fell, and the gap between what a Technicolor dye transfer print cost and what an Eastman Color print cost widened until it became indefensible to anyone holding a budget. The directors who still requested dye transfer were aging out of influence. The studio executives who approved budgets were a generation removed from the one that had seen Technicolor as essential. To them, the dye transfer surcharge was a line item, and line items exist to be cut. When the last holdouts stopped requesting the process, there was no one left to defend it. What closed in 1975 was not just a production line. It was a way of knowing. The women who loaded matrices could not transfer their skill to Eastman Color processing. The talent was not adjacent. It was specific, honed for a process that no longer existed. The dye chemists whose instincts had been calibrated over decades to the behavior of cyan, magenta, and yellow transfer dyes found that their knowledge had no market. The embodied expertise that had been Technicolor's true moat, the 10,000 microjudgments per shift, the hands that felt the click, the noses that caught a bad lot, became overnight a vocabulary for a dead language. Some workers stayed on at the plant in other capacities. Technicolor still processed Eastman Color film. It still operated as a lab, but the work was different, automated, standardized. The machines did what the hands had done, and the machines did not need to smell the stop bath or feel the matrix seat. Workers who had been artisans became operators. The pay was similar. The identity was not. Others left the industry entirely. Film processing work was not a career with lateral mobility. The skills were hyper-specific. A matrix loader could not walk into a Kodak facility and demonstrate her value because Kodak's process did not use matrices. A dye transfer technician could not retrain as a video colorist because video color correction was electronic, screen-based, performed with knobs and scopes rather than chemistry and touch. The labor market had no category for what these people knew. The woman who had loaded matrices, who had judged pressure by the sound of the rollers, who had said a good print felt like a door latching, was 53 years old in 1975. She had worked at the plant for 26 years. Her pension, such as it was, reflected a career in light manufacturing. Her mortgage reflected a two-income household in a city where real estate prices were rising faster than wages. When the dye transfer line shut down, She was offered a position in the Eastman Color processing department at a lower classification. She took it. There was no ceremony for what she had lost. The parking lot did not empty all at once. It thinned the way it had been thinning for a decade. Incrementally, without drama, one fewer car at a time. But after 1975, the cars that remained belonged to a different kind of worker doing a different kind of job in a building that remembered a different kind of purpose. The walls still smelled of acetic acid. The stains on the concrete floor were still there. The ventilation system still pushed air through ducts that had carried chemical vapor for half a century. The building was the same. The building was completely different. Outside, Hollywood continued. Studios produced more films than ever, all in color, all processed on single-strip stock at labs that competed on price and turnaround. Color had become commodity. It no longer required a factory. It required a service provider, and service providers are interchangeable. The thing that Technicolor had monopolized, the physical manufacture of color, had been dissolved into an industry of equivalence. Kalmus had died in 1963, 12 years before the line shut down. He did not see the end, but he had seen the trajectory. In his later years, he spoke less about the future. He spoke about legacy, about the archive, about the stability of dye transfer prints compared to the fugitive dyes of Eastman Color, which faded over time, reds first, then yellows, leaving a sickly cyan cast that turned sunsets into bruises and skin into wax. He was right about this. Dye transfer prints from the 1930s still hold their color today. Eastman Color prints from the 1970s have faded to ghosts. The superior technology lost. The stable archive lost. The thing that lasted was not the thing the market chose. But markets do not optimize for permanence. They optimize for the quarter, and by the quarter's logic, Technicolor's closure was not a loss. It was an efficiency. The machines cooled, the dye vats were emptied. The building went quiet in a way it had not been quiet since 1924. The building did not care what it had been. Buildings are indifferent to their own histories. But the ground is not. The ground keeps records that no archive can match. Molecular records, chemical records, records written in the language of contamination and measured in parts per billion. And the ground beneath the Technicolor plant had been keeping records for 50 years. When an industrial facility closes, there is a period, sometimes months, sometimes decades, during which the site exists in a kind of administrative limbo. The machines are removed. The lease is renegotiated or the property is sold. The new owner or tenant has plans that involve the future, not the past. But environmental law, when it catches up, is concerned with the past. It asks what was stored here, what was spilled here, what was drained, dumped, rinsed, or allowed to seep. It asks these questions not out of curiosity, but because the chemistry does not stop working when the factory stops operating. Solvents in the soil do not respect closing dates. They migrate on their own schedule, following gravity and geology, and they are patient in a way that businesses are not. In Hollywood, the questions arrived slowly and then all at once. The neighborhood around Cole Avenue had been industrial for decades. Photo labs, printing operations, dry cleaners, auto body shops. Each business had used chemicals. Each business had left traces. But when regulators and property owners began testing, the signatures were distinct. You could read the history of a site in its contamination profile the way a geologist reads rock strata. The solvents used in photographic processing were different from the solvents used in dry cleaning, which were different from the petroleum compounds used in auto repair. Each left its fingerprint. The Technicolor plant's fingerprint was legible. Decades of photographic chemistry, silver compounds, organic solvents, acidic rinse water, dye residues, had moved through the building and into the ground beneath it. The concrete floors that workers had walked on for half a century were not barriers. Concrete is porous. It absorbs. It transmits. Over time, repeated spills, routine drainage, and the simple physics of liquid finding. Its level had carried contamination downward, past the slab, into the soil, and toward the water table. This was not unique to Technicolor. Every photographic processing facility of that era, and there were many in Hollywood, faced the same legacy. But Technicolor's scale was different. Millions of feet of film, decades of operation, industrial volumes of chemistry. The cumulative load was proportional to the output, and the output had been enormous. By 2021, the contamination legacy had surfaced in the form that American industrial disputes most often take: litigation. Cleanup cost lawsuits involving former film processing sites in Hollywood entered the legal system. Disputes over who was responsible for the remediation of soil and groundwater contaminated by decades of chemical use. The arguments were technical, procedural, and expensive. They involved property owners, former operators, insurers, and environmental consultants, billing hours to determine the provenance of molecules that had been underground since before most of the lawyers were born. The legal language was sterile. The physical reality was not. Remediation of solvent-contaminated soil means excavation, digging up the ground, trucking it away, replacing it with clean fill. Or it means in situ treatment, injecting reagents into the soil to break down contaminants in place, a process that can take years and requires ongoing monitoring. Or it means containment, barriers, vapor mitigation systems, institutional controls that restrict future use. None of these options are inexpensive, none of them are fast, and none of them undo the contamination. They manage it. They translate a chemical problem into an economic one, and they distribute the cost among parties who argue over shares the way heirs argue over a will. The irony was structural, not accidental. The same industry that had sold the world images of beauty, saturated color, flawless skin, landscapes so vivid they ached, had left beneath its own city a legacy that was invisible, toxic, and unresolved. The movies were about surfaces. The contamination was about what lies beneath surfaces. And in Hollywood, where the entire economy is built on the relationship between what you see and what you do not, the contamination was not a contradiction, it was a completion. Nobody made a documentary about the soil. Documentaries were about stars, scandals, studios. The ground was not cinematic. A monitoring well drilled into a parking lot does not photograph well. A chain of custody report for a soil sample does not have a narrative arc. The contamination existed in the same city as the movies, but in a different grammar. A grammar of regulatory filings, consent orders, and remedial action plans that would never appear on any screen, in any theater, in any format, in any color. The building at 1006 North Cole Avenue was still standing. The building did not look contaminated. The building did not look like anything in particular. It looked like what it was, a low industrial structure in a neighborhood that had been rezoned, reimagined, and priced upward by the gravitational pull of the entertainment industry. The walls had been repainted. The loading docks had been repurposed. The windows that had been set high to keep light out now looked merely architectural, a design choice rather than a functional requirement. If you walked past it on a Tuesday afternoon, you would see nothing that suggested what had happened inside. No plaque, no marker, no historical designation. Just a building on a block in Hollywood, keeping its secrets the way Hollywood always has. In plain sight, behind a surface that tells you only what it wants you to know. The site at 6311 Romaine Street tells the other half of the story, the half about what happens when Hollywood decides a building is worth more as a future than as a past. The former Technicolor headquarters complex, a sprawling property that had once housed administrative offices and lab operations, did not decay into ruin. It was repositioned. In the language of commercial real estate, it became an asset with development potential. In the language of the entertainment industry, it became something more specific, a modern studio campus. The renderings appeared on developer websites and in trade publications. Glass and steel, open floor plans, production-ready sound stages, post-production suites with fiber optic connectivity. The architecture of content creation in the streaming era, clean, bright, modular, designed for a workflow that bears no physical resemblance to the process that once occupied the same ground. No dye baths, no matrix presses, no chemical mixing rooms, no smell. The new buildings would produce content measured in terabytes, not feet of film. The color would be digital, generated by software, displayed on monitors calibrated to mathematical standards, consistent by default. No one would need to feel the click. No one would need to smell the stop bath. No one would need hands. This was not erasure exactly. It was succession. Hollywood has always consumed its own history this way, not by destroying it, but by building on top of it, literally and figuratively, so that the past becomes foundation rather than memory. The sound stages where silent films were shot became the sound stages where talkies were recorded. The backlots where westerns were filmed became parking structures. The film vaults became server rooms. Each transformation preserved the economic function. This is a place where entertainment is manufactured while discarding the physical method entirely. The Romaine Street redevelopment followed this pattern. The location was valuable because it was in Hollywood, near studios, near talent, near the infrastructure of production. The specific history of the site, that it had been the headquarters of the company that gave American cinema its color, was a footnote in the marketing materials. A heritage detail, a sentence in a brochure, the kind of history that adds character to a real estate listing without adding cost to the remediation. Because remediation was part of the transaction. It always is with industrial sites. Before you build glass and steel on ground that held chemical storage, you test. Before you test, you negotiate who pays. Before you negotiate, you assess. The cycle of assessment, negotiation, remediation, and redevelopment is its own industry now, with its own professionals, its own vocabulary, its own billable hours. It runs parallel to the entertainment industry, in the same city, on the same blocks, dealing with the same ground. One industry makes things people want to see. The other deals with what those things left behind. The workers from the old plant did not appear in the renderings. They were not part of the succession narrative. The woman who loaded matrices was 79 years old when the Romaine Street redevelopment began making headlines. She had been retired for decades. Her pension covered her rent in a neighborhood she could no longer afford to buy into. The building where she had spent 26 years was a line on a property record, a contamination profile in a consultant's database, a case number in an environmental proceeding. Her hands, which had once been instruments of extraordinary precision, had the stiffness that comes with age and the particular dryness that never fully reversed after years of chemical contact. She did not follow the redevelopment news. She did not visit the site. She had no reason to. The place where she had worked no longer existed in any sense that she would recognize, even though the address was the same and the walls were still standing. This is the way industrial memory works in America. The product survives. The process is forgotten. The people who performed the process are absorbed into the general population of retirees, their expertise unmarked, their occupational exposures untracked, their contribution to the thing that everyone remembers, the color, the saturation, the glow, invisible. You can watch The Wizard of Oz tonight. You can see the red of the ruby slippers, the green of the emerald city, the yellow of the brick road. You can feel the richness that dye transfer produced. You cannot see the hands that produced it. You cannot smell the room. You cannot feel the click. Hollywood did not stop manufacturing dreams. It stopped washing them in dye. The new tenants of the Romaine Street campus would make content for platforms that distribute to screens measured in inches, phones, tablets, laptops. The color on those screens is generated by pixels, not pigment. It is consistent because it is computed. It does not fade. It does not require craft. It does not accumulate in the soil. The progress is real, the loss is also real, and the two coexist on the same piece of ground, separated by a few feet of concrete and fill dirt and whatever remains in the earth that no one has tested yet. There is a particular quality of light in Hollywood at 6 in the morning, before the traffic thickens and the air turns hazy, when the sun is low enough to hit the sides of buildings at an angle that makes even industrial architecture look composed. It is the light that cinematographers once called magic hour, though it happens twice a day and is not magic at all. It is geometry, the angle of incidence, the filtering of wavelength through atmosphere, the accident of latitude and season that gives Los Angeles its specific golden cast. Technicolor could not reproduce this light. No process could. But the attempt to capture it, to hold it on film, in dye, in gelatin, in a strip of cellulose that could be projected in a dark room 10,000 miles away, was the reason the plant existed. On a Tuesday morning in 2026, the block around Cole Avenue is quiet in the way that urban industrial blocks are quiet before the workday starts. A delivery truck idles at a curb. A gate is chained. A wall that once held a loading dock has been resurfaced and painted a shade of gray that a real estate developer chose from a catalog. If you stand on the sidewalk and look up, you can see the high-set windows, the ones designed to keep light out. And if you know what you are looking for, you can read the building's purpose in its architecture. But almost no one knows what to look for. The building does not explain itself. It is not required to. Somewhere in a temperature-controlled vault, the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, or the Academy Film Archive in Los Angeles, or one of a handful of private collections, a dye transfer print from 1939 sits in a can. The can is sealed. The air inside is controlled. The print has not been projected in years, perhaps decades. But if you opened the can and held the film up to a light source, the color would still be there. Not faded, not shifted. The cyan, the magenta, the yellow, laid down by hand, transferred by pressure, dried on racks in a building that smelled of acetic acid and warm gelatin. Still holding, still vivid, still precisely what they were, the day a woman whose name was never listed in any credits inspected the strip under a safe light and judged it good. This is the thing about dye transfer color. It was made to last. The dyes were chosen for their molecular stability. The gelatin was chosen for its archival properties. The process was slow and expensive and labor-intensive precisely because permanence was part of the specification. Eastman Color, the stock that replaced it, was faster, cheaper, and fugitive. Its dyes broke down under exposure to light and heat, the reds fading first, then the yellows, leaving behind a cyan ghost of the original image. Thousands of films from the 1960s through the 1980s survive only in this degraded form, their color irretrievably lost because the industry chose the economical process over the durable one. The prints that last are the ones that came from the factory that closed. The prints that faded are the ones that came from the process that won. The market does not optimize for what endures. It optimizes for what is available on Tuesday. The woman who loaded matrices never used the word archival. She did not think in those terms. She thought in terms of the shift, the batch, the run, the feel of the rollers, the sound of a good transfer. She did not know that the prints she made would outlast the prints that replaced them. She did not know that decades later, archivists and preservationists would study her work with the reverence usually reserved for hand-illuminated manuscripts, marveling at the stability, the density, the fact that time had not touched what machines and chemicals and human hands had made in a light-proof room on a side street in Hollywood. She knew the click. She knew the hiss. She knew which sound meant the color would hold. The building on Cole Avenue is still there. The soil beneath it carries a record of everything the building ever produced. Not the movies, not the color, not the images that audiences gasped at in 1939. The other record, the invisible one, the one written in solvents and silver and acid, in parts per billion, in the patient language of contamination, migrating through groundwater at a rate determined by geology and gravity and nothing else. Two records of the same enterprise. One projected onto screens around the world, preserved in vaults, studied by scholars, remembered by anyone who has ever watched a Technicolor film and felt the color reach them in a way they could not explain. The other locked in the earth, measured by consultants, disputed by lawyers, carried in the bodies of workers who did not always know the names of the chemicals they breathed. The bright record and the dark record, made in the same rooms, by the same hands, in the same silence. The plant is quiet now. It has been quiet for a long time. The machines are gone. The dye vats are gone. The matrices, the rollers, the safe lights, the mixing stations, the drums of solvent stacked in the backlot, all gone. What remains is a building that looks like any other building, on a street that looks like any other street, in a city that has always been better at producing images than at remembering what the production cost. The brightest colors in American film were born here. The ground remembers what the screen does not. And now, only silence holds both.